Northumberland, England, December 1944. The radio crackled to life in Barracks 7 at precisely 8:00 p.m., the sound cutting through air thick with pipe smoke and the wet wool smell of drying uniforms. Through the static, a voice emerged. German. Clear, unaccented German speaking about Christmas traditions, about snow in the Black Forest, about families gathering around trees lit with real candles. Every man in the room froze. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. Cards remained unplayed in suspended hands. They knew this voice. What they didn't know was how it had gotten onto the BBC, or why British authorities had allowed it, or what would happen to the man who was speaking. If you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person who keeps history alive. So do me one favour. Tap like so this story isn't buried. Show support by subscribing so you don't miss the next chapter, and share this video so more people discover the truth history tried to hide. The journey toward that impossible broadcast had begun 6 months earlier on a different kind of night. Sergeant Klaus Richter stood in the processing line at Camp 18, Featherstone Park, watching rain turn the Northumberland hills into grey ghosts. He was 28 years old, a radio operator from Dresden who had spent 3 years transmitting coordinates, weather reports and coded messages from North Africa to Italy to France. Now he transmitted nothing. Around him, 400 German prisoners shuffled forward in the queue, surrendering watches, photographs, letters, anything the British deemed potentially dangerous. Which apparently included Richter's most precious possession, a small leather journal where he had been documenting radio frequencies, signal patterns, atmospheric interference data. Not for military purposes. The war was over for him. He simply couldn't stop thinking like a radio man. The British officer examining the journal was young, maybe 22, with the careful, precise movements of someone who had seen too much too quickly. He flipped through pages covered in technical notation, frequency charts, signal strength calculations. "You're a signal specialist," the officer said. Not a question. "I was." "No past tense in wireless," the officer replied, surprising Richter. "Signals don't stop existing just because you stop transmitting them." He closed the journal, but didn't confiscate it. Instead, he wrote something on Richter's processing card, a notation Richter couldn't read from his position. The camp emerged from the rain like something between a prison and a village. Rows of wooden huts with pitched roofs, arranged in precise military order, but softened somehow by the British landscape. Trees everywhere. Not the stark efficiency of German camps, but something more organic, as if the buildings had been negotiated with the earth rather than imposed upon it. The guards were professional but not cruel, distant but not cold. They counted prisoners with methodical precision, then directed them to mess hall. This was where the first strange thing happened. The meal wasn't watery soup or stale bread. Boiled potatoes, mutton, carrots, tea with real sugar. Richter stared at his plate the way a man stares at a map that doesn't match the terrain. Around him, men ate in confused silence. "They're fattening us for something," muttered Werner Koch, a tank commander from Hamburg who had the permanently suspicious expression of someone who had learned that kindness was usually a trap. But the trap never sprung. Days became weeks. The routine was simple, almost boring. Roll call at 6:00 a.m. Work details in the fields or workshops, meals at regular intervals, free time in the evenings. No brutality, no starvation, just the strange limbo of captivity without cruelty. The British called it re-education through example. The Germans called it psychological warfare by kindness. Richter was assigned to the camp workshop, repairing equipment. Radios mostly. British military radios that had been damaged or were functioning poorly. The irony wasn't lost on him. 3 years of using radio to kill, now using the same skills to repair. The workshop supervisor was a Scottish sergeant named Donald MacLeish, a man with hands scarred from a lifetime of fixing things and eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail. He watched Richter work for 3 days before speaking beyond basic instructions. "You're overqualified for this," McLeish said, watching Richter diagnose a faulty receiver in under 2 minutes. "I was trained well." "Trained, hell. You've got the instinct. The way you listen to static like it's telling you stories." Richter paused, surprised. "You understand radio?" "Merchant marine before the war. Wireless operator on cargo ships. You learn to hear what the noise is saying, or you end up lost at sea." They worked in silence after that. But it was a different kind of silence. The silence of 2 men who spoke the same technical language, even if their native tongues were enemies. In the evenings, Richter sat in the day room and listened to the BBC, not because he particularly wanted to, but because there was nothing else. The British allowed 1 radio per barracks, positioned prominently, volume set by guards. It was psychological warfare disguised as entertainment. News broadcasts detailing German defeats, descriptions of bombed cities, interviews with refugees, testimony from liberated camps. Some prisoners refused to listen. They sat in corners, playing cards, telling old war stories, pretending the war was going differently than it was. Others listened with stone faces, processing information that contradicted everything they had been told. Richter listened like a radio man, not just to the words, but to the silences between them, the frequency of certain topics, the tone shifts, the production quality. He began to notice patterns. The BBC was good, technically excellent. Their signal strength was consistent, their announcers professional, their content carefully structured to inform without obvious propaganda. But there was something missing, something he couldn't quite identify until late November, when they broadcast a program about Christmas traditions across Allied nations. American soldiers describing Thanksgiving that bled into Christmas preparation. French families talking about midnight mass. Polish refugees remembering celebrations in displaced persons camps. It was well produced, moving even, but it was one-sided. Every story was about Allied triumph, Allied resilience, Allied hope. There were no German voices, not even German civilians. It was as if 80 million people had simply ceased to exist as humans, had become only an enemy, a threat, a problem to be solved. "They're not wrong to exclude us," said Franz Becker, a former schoolteacher from Munich who had somehow maintained his thoughtfulness through years of war. He and Richter had fallen into the habit of sitting together during evening broadcasts. "We're the villains of this story. Why would they give us voices?" "Because," Richter said slowly, working through the thought as he spoke, "propaganda only works if people believe it. And people stop believing when the story is too simple, when there are no contradictions, no complexity, just good and evil." "You think the BBC wants to be believed?" "I think the BBC wants to be trusted. That's different, and trust requires acknowledging complexity, even uncomfortable complexity." The idea came to him that night, though he didn't recognize it as an idea yet, just a technical problem, a frequency imbalance in the signal. The next morning, Richter asked McLeish a question. "The BBC broadcasts, do they ever include perspectives from prisoners, from Germans who are learning what actually happened?" McLeish's hands stilled on the radio chassis he was examining. "Why do you ask?" "Because I'm hearing their signal every night, and there's a gap in it. Listeners hear about Germans as enemies, but not as people who were deceived, who are confronting what our government did. There's no bridge between the German people and the truth they need to hear." "That's a political question, not a technical one." "Everything about radio is political," Richter replied. "Where you place the microphone, who you allow to speak, what frequency you choose. But it's also technical. And right now they're broadcasting on a frequency that Germans in Germany can't fully receive." McLeish studied him for a long moment. "You're saying the BBC's signal to Germany isn't reaching people?" "I'm saying it's reaching them, but they're not listening. Because why would they trust enemy radio? But if that enemy radio included voices of German prisoners who are discovering the truth, who are processing it honestly, maybe that changes the signal, makes it receivable. That's not how it works, isn't it? You were merchant marine. You know about distress signals. When a ship is sinking, the signal that saves lives isn't the one that says we're fine. It's the one that says we need help. Truth is the most powerful frequency there is. McLeish returned to his work, but Richter could see the idea had landed. 2 weeks passed. Richter continued repairing radios, continued listening to the BBC, continued thinking about signals and truth and how you bridge the gap between propaganda and reality. Then, on a grey December morning, McLeish approached him with a proposition. There's someone who wants to meet you. From the BBC. They're doing research on German POW perspectives. You'd be under no obligation to participate in anything. Just a conversation. Richter's first thought was trap. His second thought was curiosity. His third thought was, what do I have to lose? The man from the BBC was named Edward Murrow, though Richter later learned this was not the famous American broadcaster, but a producer who shared the name. He was thin, wearing a wool coat that had seen better days, with eyes that suggested he had spent too many nights in bombed cities, watching the world burn. They met in the camp commandant's office, a space that smelled of tea and old paper. McLeish sat in the corner, ostensibly as guard, but really as witness. Sergeant Richter, Murrow began, his German heavily accented but functional. I'm told you have thoughts about our broadcasts. I have thoughts about all broadcasts. Occupational habit. A flicker of something, amusement, crossed Murrow's face. Sergeant McLeish says you believe we're missing something in our programming to Germany. I believe you're broadcasting truth to people who have been trained to disbelieve truth. That's a technical problem as much as a content problem. Explain. Richter leaned forward. For 12 years, Germans were told that foreign radio was all lies, Jewish propaganda, enemy deception. Most people in Germany still believe that. So when you broadcast evidence of concentration camps, descriptions of war crimes, they dismiss it. Not because the evidence isn't compelling, but because the source is automatically suspect. So, what would you have us do? Include voices they can't automatically dismiss. German voices, prisoners of war who are learning the same things you're trying to teach, who are processing the shock, the horror, the betrayal. Not as propaganda, but as genuine discovery. Murrow was silent for a long time, tapping a pencil against his notepad. You understand what you're suggesting? If we did this, you wouldn't be speaking to Britain. You'd be speaking to Germany, to people who might know you, recognize your voice. You'd be labelled a traitor by many, marked for the rest of your life. I understand. Why would you do this? Richter thought about Dresden, about his sister who still lived there, if she lived at all, about the children he used to see walking to school, the same children who had been taught to salute and march and believe in a 1,000-year Reich, about all the lies he had helped transmit through the air, all the coded messages that had helped perpetuate a war that never should have been fought. Because, he said carefully, I spent 3 years as a transmitter, broadcasting orders, coordinates, lies. I never questioned what I was sending, just made sure the signal was clear. Now I have a chance to transmit something true, to use radio the way it was meant to be used, to connect people across distances, to bridge understanding, to carry voices that need to be heard. Noble sentiments. Technical necessity, Richter corrected. The war is ending. Germany will need to rebuild. But you can't rebuild on lies. Someone has to start transmitting truth, even if the truth is painful, especially if it's painful. Murrow studied him, then nodded slowly. I'll take this to my superiors. I make no promises. The politics are complex, but the idea has merit. He stood to leave, then paused. What would you say, if given the chance? Richter had been thinking about this for weeks, working through it the way he worked through signal problems, finding the right frequency, the right approach, the right words to carry across static and distance and disbelief. "I would talk about Christmas," he said, "about the traditions we grew up with, the things that made us German before the Reich tried to redefine what that meant. And then I would talk about what I've learned here, about the camps I didn't know existed, about the people who were murdered in our name, not as political statement, but as personal reckoning. One man facing what he failed to see. And you think people would listen? I think some wouldn't, many wouldn't, but some would, and sometimes one clear signal in the noise is all you need." Murrow left. Days passed. Richter continued repairing radios, continued listening to broadcasts, continued wondering if he had just volunteered for something brave or something foolish. Then, on December 18th, McLeish found him in the workshop. "They said yes. You'll broadcast on Christmas Eve. 15 minutes, live. They'll vet your script, but they've agreed not to censor unless it's militarily sensitive. The Commandant has approved it." Richter's hands, normally steady when working with delicate electronics, trembled slightly. "What happens after? To me?" "Nothing punitive. You'll remain here, same as before. Though I'd expect reactions from other prisoners won't all be positive." "I know." That night, Richter began writing. Not a speech, but a transmission. He thought about frequency, about signal strength, about how you craft a message that can travel through static and reach the people who need to hear it most. He wrote about Christmas in Dresden, about his father, who had taught him about radio, who had believed that technology could bring people together rather than drive them apart, about the tree his family decorated each year with real candles, dangerous and beautiful, requiring vigilance so the beauty didn't become disaster. He wrote about the war, about serving in North Africa, transmitting coordinates for artillery strikes, never seeing the results, just sending numbers into the air. About the distance radio creates, how you can participate in violence without witnessing it, how abstraction makes cruelty easier. He wrote about capture, about expecting execution, torture, degradation. About finding instead porridge and potatoes and Scottish sergeants who understood that radio operators speak a language beyond nations. He wrote about the documentary footage they had been shown. The British had made it mandatory. All prisoners had to watch films from liberated camps, footage from Bergen-Belsen, from Buchenwald, bodies stacked like timber, survivors who looked like animated skeletons, children with eyes that had seen things no eyes should see. He wrote about how the room had erupted in denial. Men shouting that it was fake, Allied propaganda, bodies from bombing raids staged to look like systematic murder. He wrote about how he had wanted to believe them, how he had tried to find technical evidence of manipulation, doctoring, artificial staging. He wrote about the moment he couldn't deny it anymore. About recognizing a German sign in the background of one shot. About seeing an SS guard in another, his uniform unmistakable. About the math that couldn't be manipulated, thousands of bodies, millions missing, camps across an entire continent. He wrote about shame. Not the performative shame of propaganda, but the real kind. The kind that sits in your chest like undigested food, that makes you wake in the night wondering who you were and who you might have been if you had questioned, if you had looked, if you had cared enough to see. And he wrote about Christmas, about how this year, for the first time in his life, he would celebrate it, knowing the full cost of his nation's choices. About how the light of those candles looked different now, more fragile, more necessary. About how you rebuild from ruins, not by forgetting what caused the destruction, but by remembering so clearly that you never build the same way again. The script was 12 pages, handwritten in careful German. He showed it to Becker first, the school teacher. Becker read in silence, his face a careful mask. When he finished, he set the pages down gently. "They will hate you for this," he said quietly. "Many already hate me for considering it. No. They will truly hate you. You're confirming what they don't want to believe. You're validating Allied claims. You're telling the truth. Yes, Becker said. That's what I mean. Richter submitted the script to Murrow, who read it with the Commandant and McLeish present. The Commandant was an older man named Colonel Harrison, who had fought in the First War and clearly wanted nothing to do with a second. He finished reading and looked at Richter with something like sadness. You understand this will follow you? When you return to Germany, this broadcast will be known. You're creating a permanent record of choosing Allied narrative over German loyalty. I'm creating a record of choosing truth over lies, Richter replied. I understand some will see that as betrayal. Most will see it as betrayal. Then I'll have to live with that. But I can't live with staying silent. The broadcast was scheduled for December 24th, 8:00 p.m. They would use the camp's administrative radio room, which had proper equipment for transmission to BBC Central. From there, it would be rebroadcast to Germany on medium-wave frequencies that could penetrate deep into the Reich territory. Word spread through Camp 18 like static through copper wire. The German prisoner who was going to broadcast on the BBC. Some men confronted Richter directly, called him traitor, collaborator, weak. Others avoided him, treating him like he was already dead, already erased from the community of German soldiers. A few, like Becker, said nothing but stood near him during meals, a quiet statement of support that meant more than words. On the morning of December 24th, snow fell across Northumberland, real snow, the kind that muffled sound and made everything look clean. Richter watched it through the workshop window, remembering Dresden, wondering if his sister was alive to see snow this year. McLeish found him there, hands still, watching white accumulate on bare trees. Second thoughts? Richter shook his head. Third, fourth, fifth thoughts, but not second thoughts. Not about the core of it. What's the core? That silence is a kind of static. It blocks the signal. Someone has to break the silence, even if breaking it means becoming noise yourself. At 7:30 p.m., they moved Richter to the administrative building. The radio room was small, professionally equipped, with a microphone mounted on a desk. Murrow was there, making final adjustments. A technician monitored levels. Colonel Harrison stood against the wall, witness to history or disaster, not yet clear which. You'll have exactly 15 minutes, Murrow said. I'll give you a signal when you have 2 minutes remaining. Speak clearly, don't rush. Remember, you're not performing, you're transmitting. There's a difference. I know. At 7:55, they connected the line to London. At 7:58, Richter sat before the microphone, his script in front of him, his hands steady now that the moment had arrived. At 8:00, Murrow pointed. Richter began. Guten Abend. Good evening. My name is Klaus Richter. I am a sergeant in the German Wehrmacht, currently a prisoner of war in England. Tonight, on Christmas Eve, I want to speak to you about truth and about lies and about what I have learned in these months of captivity. In Barracks 7, the radio crackled to life. The voice was German, clear, unaccented, familiar. Men froze. Someone whispered, "That's Richter." Someone else, "Turn it off. Don't listen to traitor propaganda." But no one moved to turn it off. They stood, sat, suspended between denial and curiosity, unable to look away from the radio, even as they wanted to, needed to. Richter's voice continued. He spoke about Christmas in Dresden, about his father, about candles on trees. His voice was steady, conversational, intimate. He wasn't shouting, wasn't performing, just speaking, one man to anyone who would listen. Then his tone shifted. I want to tell you about something I saw 3 weeks ago. The British showed us film from the concentration camps. Many of you have heard rumours. I want to tell you they are not rumours. They are not exaggerations. They are not Allied propaganda. In Barracks 7, the temperature seemed to drop. Men's faces hardened, closed off. This was the moment. The betrayal. But Richter didn't stop. He described the footage, not with drama, but with precision. The technical details that couldn't be faked. The German words visible in backgrounds, the uniforms of guards, the geography of camps located in Germany itself. "I know you will want to disbelieve this," his voice said through the static. I wanted to disbelieve it. I spent days trying to find evidence it was manipulated. I am a radio operator. I understand how signals can be distorted, how truth can be bent. But this was not distortion. This was documentation of reality. Werner Koch, the suspicious tank commander, stood abruptly as if to leave. But he didn't leave. He stood there, hands clenched, listening. Richter's voice spoke about shame. Not the shame of defeat, but the shame of complicity, of serving a system without questioning, of transmitting orders without asking what those orders meant, of being technically excellent while morally asleep. "Tonight is Christmas Eve," the voice said, "a night when we remember light in darkness, when we celebrate hope, family, peace. But I cannot celebrate those things without also acknowledging the darkness we created, the families we destroyed, the peace we shattered." Someone in the barracks started to cry, quietly, trying to hide it. No one looked at him. Everyone heard. "I am speaking to you tonight not because the British forced me. They did not. Not because I have been brainwashed. I have not. I am speaking because someone needs to break the silence. Someone needs to transmit truth into the noise of denial." "You will call me traitor. I understand. But I ask you to consider, is it betrayal to speak truth? Or is betrayal staying silent when silence allows lies to continue? Is it loyalty to deny crimes committed in our name? Or is real loyalty demanding that our nation face what it has done so we can become something better? In the radio room, Richter's hands were steady on the desk, his voice clear. He had 2 minutes remaining. Murrow held up 2 fingers. Richter nodded, continued. "I don't know what Germany will look like when this war ends. I don't know if I will have a home to return to. I don't know if my family survived. But I know this. We cannot rebuild on lies. We cannot create something new from the same foundation of hatred and denial that brought us here. Tonight, when you light your candles, when you gather with whoever remains of your families, I ask you to do something difficult. I ask you to question what you have been told, not by the BBC, not by Allied radio, but by our own government. Question the stories we told ourselves about who we were and what we were doing. Question why we believed some people were less human than others. Question why we accepted violence as necessary. Question why we looked away when our neighbours disappeared. Question why we chose comfort over conscience." His voice softened, became almost gentle. "I am not asking you to hate Germany. I love Germany. I love our language, our music, our history. But love requires honesty. Real love sees clearly and loves anyway. Dishonest love protects and enables and ultimately destroys what it claims to cherish. So this Christmas Eve, I choose honesty. I choose to say, we did terrible things. Our government committed crimes that language struggles to describe. Many of us participated through action or silence. And we must face this. Not because the Allies demand it, but because our own humanity demands it. That is the only path forward. Through truth, through acknowledgement, through the hard work of becoming better than we were." Murrow held up his hand. 30 seconds. "This is Klaus Richter, German prisoner of war, transmitting truth on Christmas Eve, 1944. May you find the courage to listen. May we all find the courage to change. Frohe Weihnachten. Merry Christmas." The transmission ended. In the radio room, silence. Murrow nodded slowly. That went to all of Germany. Medium wave, strong signal. They heard it. Richter leaned back, suddenly exhausted. Now what? Now we see what ripples in the signal. In Barracks 7, the silence was absolute. The radio had moved on to traditional Christmas music, carols in English. Someone finally reached over and turned it off. Werner Koch stood in the center of the room, his face a complicated landscape of anger and confusion, and something that might have been grudging respect. "He's a traitor," Koch said, but his voice lacked conviction. "He told the truth," Becker replied quietly. "Those aren't mutually exclusive," someone else said. "Maybe they should be," a younger prisoner added. "Maybe if telling truth makes you a traitor, the problem isn't the truth teller." The argument that followed lasted hours. Voices raised, accusations thrown, some men defending Richter, others condemning him. But everyone was talking. Everyone was engaging. The silence had broken. That was the real signal. Over the following weeks, reports filtered back through Red Cross channels. The broadcast had reached Germany. Reaction was mixed, as expected. Many dismissed it as propaganda, as Allied manipulation. But some listened, some questioned, some began to look more carefully at what was happening around them, to ask questions they had been afraid to ask. In February, Richter received a letter through the Red Cross. It was from his sister in Dresden. She was alive. The letter was short, carefully worded to pass censors. But one line stood clear. "I heard your voice on Christmas Eve. I'm listening now. Thank you for the courage to speak." He read that line 17 times, held the paper like it was the most fragile and important thing he had ever touched. She had heard him. One person, across static and distance and denial, had received the signal. McLeish found him holding the letter, tears on his face. "Good news?" "She's alive. And she heard me. She's listening." That's all you can ask for, isn't it? One person listening. It's everything. The war ended in May 1945. The full scope of the Holocaust became undeniable as camps across Europe were liberated. The footage Richter had described was now supplemented by hundreds of hours more, by testimony from thousands of survivors, by documentation that made denial impossible except for those committed to living in fiction. In Camp 18, the mood was strange. Relief that the war was over. Horror at the full truth. Uncertainty about what came next. For Richter, there was an additional complexity. His broadcast had been heard by millions. Some praised him. Many condemned him. His name was known. When repatriation began in late 1945, Richter was among the last to return. There were security concerns. Questions about whether returning to Germany was safe for a man who had publicly broken with Nazi ideology on enemy radio. Colonel Harrison called him to his office one final time before departure. "You have options," Harrison said. "We can facilitate immigration to Britain if you want it, or Canada. Fresh start, away from judgment." Richter considered this. It was tempting. Start over. Leave Klaus Richter the traitor behind. Become someone new. But that would be another kind of silence. Another kind of static blocking the signal. "I need to go back," he said. "Germany needs people who will tell the truth. Who will teach the next generation differently. If everyone who saw clearly leaves, who's left to transmit the signal? It won't be easy. Nothing worth transmitting ever is." He returned to Dresden in November 1945. The city was ruins. The beautiful Baroque architecture he remembered was rubble. The streets of his childhood were moonscapes. His family home was gone, vaporized in the firebombing. His sister was living in a displaced persons camp on the outskirts. When he found her, she looked older than her years, worn by hunger and fear and loss. But her eyes held something he recognized, the same thing he had seen in the mirror since that Christmas Eve broadcast: clarity, the painful gift of seeing truly. They didn't speak for a long moment. Then she said, "You were right. Everything you said. I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't not believe it anymore." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. You gave me the courage to stop lying to myself. That's a gift, even when it hurts." Over the following years, Richter rebuilt his life in Dresden. He couldn't work in radio. His broadcast had made him too controversial, too marked. Instead, he taught electronics, initially, at a technical school. But really, he taught critical thinking. He taught students to question, to verify, to demand evidence, to resist simple narratives. He taught them that being technically skilled wasn't enough. You had to ask what you were building, who it served, what it would do in the world. He never broadcast again. But in a way, he never stopped broadcasting. Every student he taught became another receiver, another node in the network of people committed to seeing clearly and speaking honestly. In 1952, the BBC did a follow-up story. They tracked down Richter in Dresden, now part of East Germany. The interview was conducted carefully, with awareness of Soviet monitoring. But Richter spoke plainly. "People ask if I regret the broadcast," he told the interviewer. "I don't. Not because it was easy, it wasn't. Not because it made me popular, it didn't. But because silence would have been worse. Silence would have been another transmission, a signal that said truth doesn't matter, that comfort is more important than honesty. What happened that Christmas Eve was simple. I used technology for what it was designed for, to connect, to communicate, to carry truth across distance. For years, I had used it to transmit lies and violence. That night, I finally used it correctly." The BBC producer asked what he hoped people would learn from his story. Richter thought for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "That speaking truth is technical work. It requires precision, courage, and the right frequency. That silence is not neutrality. It's always a choice, and usually a cowardly one. That one clear signal can travel farther than you imagine, can reach people you'll never meet, can change things in ways you'll never fully know. And that Christmas, more than any other holiday, is about light in darkness. Real light doesn't just happen. You have to light the candles yourself, even when it's dangerous, even when the light reveals things you'd rather not see." The interview was broadcast across Western Europe. In Barracks 7 of what had been Camp 18, now a British Army training facility, a few veterans who had served as guards gathered to listen. McLeish was among them, now retired, living in Edinburgh. When Richter's voice came through the radio, older, rougher, but still carrying that same steady clarity, McLeish smiled. "Still transmitting," he said to no one in particular, "still breaking the silence." In the decades after, historians would debate the impact of Richter's broadcast. Some argued it was overstated, that one 15-minute transmission couldn't really change minds already committed to denial. Others pointed to evidence that it reached people at a crucial moment, that it provided permission for doubt, that it modelled the possibility of facing truth. What was undeniable was this. In December 1944, a German POW spoke truth to his own people through enemy radio. He did it knowing the cost, accepting the consequences, choosing honesty over comfort. And in doing so, he demonstrated something essential about both radio and humanity. The most powerful transmissions aren't always the loudest. Sometimes the signal that matters most is the one that breaks the static of silence, that says clearly and simply, "I see what happened. I will not pretend otherwise. I will speak truth even when truth is painful, especially when truth is painful." That signal travelled across Europe on Christmas Eve 1944. It travelled through decades after, carried forward by students who learned to question, by children of those students who inherited critical thinking, by the slow accumulation of people who chose seeing over blindness. It travels still, every time someone chooses honesty over comfort, every time someone breaks silence about injustice, every time someone uses technology not to amplify lies but to transmit truth. Klaus Richter died in 1987, in Dresden, surrounded by former students who had become teachers themselves. His obituary in the East German newspaper was brief, carefully neutral. But the West German papers told his story fully. The man who spoke truth on Christmas Eve, one headline read. At his funeral, his sister gave the eulogy. She spoke about candles on Christmas trees, beautiful and dangerous, requiring vigilance so beauty doesn't become disaster. She spoke about her brother's courage to light those candles even in the darkest moment, to risk the danger because light was necessary. And she spoke about legacy, not the kind measured in monuments or public recognition, but the kind measured in transformed minds, in students who learn to think critically, in a slow network of people committed to truth spreading like ripples from one clear signal. My brother taught me, she said, that silence is also a choice. That neutrality in the face of evil is still choosing the side of evil. That speaking truth, even painful truth, is the only way forward. He taught me that real love sees clearly and loves anyway, that you don't honor your country by lying about it, but by demanding it become worthy of love. Most of all, he taught me that one person, speaking clearly, can transmit a signal that travels farther than distance should allow. That truth has its own frequency, and if you broadcast on that frequency with precision and courage, someone will receive it. Someone will listen. Someone will change. That's all we can do. Transmit truth. Hope it reaches someone. Trust that one connection is enough to start changing the signal. The barracks at Featherstone Park were demolished in 1958. The land returned to farming, then to development. Nothing remains of Camp 18 except photographs in archives and memories in aging minds. But the signal transmitted from there on December 24, 1944, still echoes, still carries, still reminds us that the most powerful frequency is truth, and the bravest transmission is speaking it when silence would be easier. On Christmas Eve, each year, in a small church in Dresden, someone lights a candle for Klaus Richter. They do this not because he was perfect or because his choice was easy. They do it because he demonstrated what courage looks like in its most essential form. Not the courage of violence or domination, the courage of honesty. The courage to say, I was wrong, we were wrong, and we must face what we did so we can become something better. That candle burns each year, one small light in the darkness, one clear signal in the static. One transmission that says, truth matters, silence is a choice, speak clearly, even when speaking costs you everything. Because sometimes the signal you transmit reaches exactly the person who needs to hear it. Sometimes one voice breaking the silence is enough. Sometimes telling the truth is the only thing that matters.